Welcome to our talk on corruptive care techniques. This was made by myself, Liam Sinclair, and Ellie Hills of Reptiles and Research. So before we even get to what cooperative care is, we have to first establish why it even matters in the first place. And to do that, I need to build a foundation for you on animal welfare to really hone in on why you should care in the first place. We begin with what is animal welfare. So animal welfare can be defined as how an animal is coping and the conditions in which it lives. It considers both the physical and psychological well-being of an individual. The welfare state of an individual is how it's feeling. And yes, they are completely capable of emotions and feel both positive and negative emotions. So at this point, you're like, wait, reptiles have emotions? I thought everyone knew that reptiles couldn't have emotions. Well, in actuality, reptiles have all the necessary brain components to possess these emotions. The hypothalamus controls the basic emotions like hunger or thirst, but also the more complex ones such as moods or anger. The amygdala deals in memory, anxiety, and depression, and then the hippocampus deals in long-term memory, and it contextualizes emotions based upon past experiences. So let's say we've got an animal that's gone over something sharp in a particular part of their enclosure. Well, they'll have an emotional reaction to that stimulus, that pain, the upset, the distress, the fear, the frustration. Maybe they react in anger at that sharp feeling. The hippocampus is going to contextualize that emotion based on that experience, so in the future it's going to remember that past experience and likely result in them not going in that particular part of the enclosure or just not repeating that behavior that led to that incident. So then we get to the point, okay, cool, so let's say they have all this, but they don't have what we consider the more complex element, which is our human or just mammalian neocortex. Well, actually, the dorsal ventricular ridge is thought to be the equivalent of the human neocortex. So the cells that are in the pallium in both reptiles and mammals, including us, are exactly the same. Now, what this does, it gives them impulse control and complex learning. So yes, they do have emotions. And not only do they have emotions, but these emotions have a purpose. Many might think that species such as ourselves are a highly social species, so these emotions make sense in allowing us to build these powerful familial bonds in making this social species a totally close-knit family unit, right? That makes sense. So the question someone might ask is, well, why would a solitary animal need emotions? Well, the emotions have a purpose and they help guide an individual's actions. For example, pleasurable emotions are often derived from actions that increase survival, and the reverse is true for negative emotions. So let's say we have a reptile that finds a load of seeds about, and those seeds are full of fat that are going to allow them to put on weight and get through a breeding season or even just survive that year. Well, they're not actually thinking, right, it's got fats that I need, and I've got this time period that I need this, and this, so therefore I need to plan out this micronutrient. No, they're not thinking like that. It's purely, this is tasty, it's palatable, and it's a pleasurable experience eating this. I'm hungry, and eating this is pleasurable. So it's those pleasurable emotions and the emotions that are derived from that action that increase the likelihood they'll increase and repeat that behavior and increase the survival rate of that individual. And the reverse is true for the negative emotions. Let's say you've got a plant that's mildly toxic that doesn't outright kill them. If they eat that plant and it's a herbivorous animal and they have a negative emotion in response to that, whether they get gastric upset or it stings the mouth, they have a negative emotion to that. Again, the hippocampus contextualizes that based on past experiences. They have that negative emotion and they will decrease actions that decrease the likelihood of survival. So the emotions have a purpose in directing decisions they make about day-to-day survival. Or another example might be a reptile takes pleasure in basking. The skin cells release endorphins in response to that sunlight, and that feel-good factor encourages the animal to repeat that behavior. The animal isn't aware of the chemical process of subcutaneous synthesis of D3 happening in their body, only that it feels good. They're not sat there thinking, right, okay, so I've got calcitriol and calcidiol, and then it goes to my liver. And they don't think that. It's just, this is nice. This feels good to bask. Again, it's that emotion that's derived by doing something that increases the rate of survival that drives them to repeat it. They're not machines thinking about what's going on under the hood. They're just thinking about, hey, this is nice, this is pleasurable, I'll do this again. The same thing happens with us humans. If we go and sunbathe at the beach, we're not thinking about, right, I need to get enough vitamin D today, so therefore, nope, you're just going there and thinking, hey, let's sunbathe, this feels good, this is a good time. Exactly the same thing. The emotions are present throughout the animal kingdom, and it evolved for survival. We were wrong. We were wrong to think that these animals didn't have emotions, when actually, logically speaking, now that we know better, it's easy to look back at how we thought before and think, how could we possibly think that? It's quite logical to assume that these emotions are here and have a purpose, because it just makes sense. So now we've established that yes, our reptiles do have emotions. What's the difference between an emotion and a mood? And hopefully this will add a little bit of clarity for some of you as well. So an emotion is an emotional state that is an immediate response to a stimuli, like excitement over being fed or fear from being grabbed. And a mood is the long-term state that is felt by an animal, like a relaxed or comfortable mood by being provided with an appropriate environment. But those two things can conflict each other, or you might have things happening at the same time. So let's say we've got a ball python in a rack, right? It's a very small, cramped, minimalistic rack with just a water bowl and no substrate, nothing else. Well, over a long period of time, the animal might have low adaptability, low ability to cope with change, and be increased fearfulness, basically in this overall depressed mood, which is the long-term state felt by the animal. But at feeding time, when you feed that royal python, it's going to get a dopamine hit and it feel excitement over being fed, and it can feel an emotional state as an immediate response to that stimulus. So it can feel an immediate emotion when being fed, but once they've eaten, that emotion subsides and they return to their baseline long-term mood state. So you can have two things happening at the same time. So it's really important to understand in animal welfare the definitions and how to look at the nuanced situations between. Because if you can't, and you don't understand why we have terminology, and you don't understand why we have these definitions, then you can't see the bigger picture, and you can't see the nuance in a situation in front of you. Let's say you've got dogs in a rescue, and you say that you've got overall a dog is suffering in a negative state of welfare, and it has an overall poor mood. But if you give it a treat, it has excitement. Our emotional reaction to that as humans might be, well, it was happy and excited and wagging its tail at that point. Therefore, there's a reason to not euthanize, when in actuality, the 95% of that dog's life is suffering and it should be euthanized. So by knowing the difference between mood and emotion, it makes us far better at analysing what's really happening in front of us, and it makes us better keepers or care providers. So now we get into why is this so contentious for some people, and that is the fear of anthropomorphism. And we need to go into what are the actual attribution of human characteristics or behaviour to an animal is the actual definition, right? But many keepers fear being accused of anthropomorphism so much they're actually blind to biological truths. It isn't anthropomorphic to recognize sentience, emotional capabilities, or motivations. It's factual. And then we have the opposite of anthropomorphism, which is mechanomorphism. So that is attributing mechanical characteristics to living beings operating on nothing more than raw instincts like robots. And again, this could be not further from the truth. So what's the reality? So the reality is this graph I made here, this spectrum, if you will. So over on the left, we have mechanomorphism. They are nothing more than primitive reptiles operating on base instincts. They need only food, water, and shelter. And then over on the far right, we've got anthropomorphism. And that's true anthropomorphism, which is my bearded dragon loves me and loves when I paint her nails, applying human characteristics to that animal. And in the middle, we've got animal welfare science, which is reptiles are sentient beings with complex needs that involve both physiological and psychological health, of which we can measure a welfare state. The problem is that you have keepers that are so fearful of being accused of being anthropomorphic that they'd start delving into mechanomorphism as like a defense mechanism. If they go so far this way and never use any language or verbiage that attributes emotions or any sort of sentience or need of complex needs to these animals, then no one can accuse them of anthropomorphism, right? But in actuality, they fear anthropomorphism so much they go off the deep end into mechanomorphism, meaning that they are so off touch of what reality is that they are no more right than someone that says, my bearded dragon loves when I paint her nails. And then what happens is you have a large section of keepers and people that are in this state of severe mechanomorphism being attributed to reptiles. And then they look towards things like maybe even saying that reptiles have emotions, which is scientifically proven, and accuse that of, in the center, the animal welfare science, and accuse that of being anthropomorphism. So lately, I see mechanomorphism being far more dangerous to animal welfare than anthropomorphism. They are no more correct than anthropomorphism, and anthropomorphism is no more correct than mechanomorphism. The true reality is here in the center, and it's true animal welfare science. So let's look at a bit of animal welfare history. So we go back to the 19th century and we look at the Cruel and Improper Treatment of Cattle Act in 1822. Now this is to stop people mutilating and abusing cattle. Let's say someone derives pleasure out of that. They were to stop that, and then we start moving into stopping suffering and the Protection of Animals Act, and then we get to the Bramble Report. And that leads to the publication of the 5 Freedoms in 1979. Right? And most of you might know the 5 freedoms. The freedom from thirst, hunger, disease. You probably know it. And then we have sort of 15 years of welfare research that only sort of focuses on the negative. Now, it wasn't until sort of 2009, for me, when a paper by Vicky Melfi came out, where she discusses that we are only looking at the avoidance of negative. So if we are only ever looking at the avoidance of negative, how can we ever start to think about how to make a good life? So if you're only ever thinking about how do we not abuse and make our animals suffer, you can only get up to a middle line of, okay, nothing bad is happening. How do we get into how to make things good happen for the animal so they have a great life? And we had no research prior to that on that, and it was all based on the avoidance of negative. So that was a key moment for me, what really stuck out in the literature, and things then began to move into researching what positive welfare states truly are. And then we go into the 5 domains. Now there's been many iterations of the 5 domains over the years, many iterations. But basically then we start to consider the mental states of an animal. We start to look at terminology like a life worth living or a good life. And what that essentially means is if you have the avoidance of negative and you actually completely avoid negative things in the animal's life, that takes you up to a neutral stance. And that is what's defined as a life worth living. If they're not suffering, it's a life worth living. And only then, and only then going into positive experiences in their lives and pleasurable experiences, can we get into a good life. So you have a life not worth living, or a life worth avoiding, a life worth living, and then a good life. So we got to systematically think about the way we're doing this to get to that point at the end. So now we're considering the mental states, and we're up to the 5 domains in 2020, which all the major big players in zoos and the welfare world are using to assess animal welfare. The problem is with herpetoculture, as you have many people that maybe learnt a long time ago. They learnt something like the 5 freedoms. But their verbiage and the language is stuck in the 5 freedoms, and I don't even know what the current science is. So even though some might feel like they're trailblazers, or they can criticize welfare science or welfare terminology, but their language is still 40 years behind. A lot of people that think they're trailblazers don't even know what the welfare world knew 10 years ago, let alone what is current and cutting edge. So now we get into the 5 domains of animal welfare. So this is from the RSPCA, this image on the left, and we've got wild horse welfare on the right. So we're looking at these 5 domains, and then the overall mental experiences and state, and the overall welfare. So let's say nutrition, based upon what I've previously told you about the domains and the avoidance of negative, then neutral, then positive, we can look at nutrition. Let's say we've got to the avoidance of negative, and we've stopped our bearded dragons getting metabolic bone disease. Great, we've got a diet that's nutritionally adequate. We've got up to neutral. But how do we get into positive and pleasurable animal welfare science and a positive animal welfare state? Is that food palatable and tasty, and is it pleasurable experience for them to eat? Is it cognitively challenging in a way that enriches the experience? You go from, first of all, not having metabolic bone disease, and yeah, it's good enough, neutral stance, then getting into pleasurable experiences. And this across the board. Once you build up these 5 domains and moving from the avoidance of negative to neutral and into positive experiences, we can truly get into positive animal welfare. So now we've got to get into welfare versus care. So historically, we've done a really bad job at conflating the two. Determining animal welfare in the past has focused on what is actually animal care, such as access to food and water. These can be inputs of care, but don't necessarily ensure good welfare. Care is what an animal receives via our husbandry practices, and welfare is what the animal experiences as a result of that care. And even I did it. I made this pyramid in 2021. Can you see where I went wrong? I've called this welfare, and I talk about basic, good, great, and optimal welfare, but actually what I'm describing here is care. Food and water and a basic thermal gradient is simple care provisions. It is not in any way a welfare state. So I'm using my terminology wrong even then. So I didn't know what I knew now, and even then I can look back and see even I did it, and it's really easy to do. And most of us went through a period of learning where the industry did conflate the two, and now current welfare is separating the two for greater distinction. So now we need to look at our care as systematic inputs versus outputs. Animals that are in captivity have had their lives controlled by us, so we need to make sure that we get this right. So let's say an input is what we put in, the thing that we do. So for example, I put in a branch, and then the output is how an animal responds to what we just did. So if a lizard climbs on the branch and expresses a species typical behavior that they are motivated to perform, that is the output. And we're measuring this as systems of ins and outs is how we optimize care. For example, let's say I were to give enrichment as an input, and I were to put food in a Kong or a feeding puzzle. But actually I didn't realise that those holes were far too small to ever get that food out. So I would naturally think, oh, I'm giving enrichment, aren't I doing great? But actually, when you think about it in inputs and outputs, you give that input, and then you would record via video or just watch, and you would watch how that animal reacts to that provision. If it gets the food out, and it gets to complete the goal behaviour, and it is positively experiencing that, great. But if it's like this scenario when it can never get that food out, what you can actually do is just essentially frustrate that animal and incite a lot of negative emotions in that animal, such as frustration or anger, and then that can lead to positive that can lead to situations that are derived from that. Let's say you give a lot of frustration to an animal, and the animal goes and takes it out on one of its enclosure mates and starts kicking off because it's really pissed off, right? So that would be a failure on our part because our inputs didn't match the output that we were expecting. So then we would have to go back, modify that provision, modify that input, make the holes bigger, and go again. But if you're not looking at things such as inputs and outputs and systematically analyzing what we're doing, we can think we're doing great when we're actually not. So why choice and agency? So providing choices can positively impact animal welfare states by giving animals a sense of control and agency. Now, agency is apparent when animals engage in voluntary, self-generated or goal-directed behaviors. And what it does is it makes decisions that they make throughout their day meaningful, however small. So now we finally get into what is cooperative care. So cooperative care involves training an animal to not only tolerate the husbandry practices or procedures that we're doing, but be an active, willing participant in these experiences. So things like station training, shift training, or target training are all parts of cooperative care. And hopefully, now that I've built the foundations of animal welfare before this part, you're starting to realize why getting them to cooperate and do that is so important. Here's an example of king snakes I've asked to shift using a target. So I want to access not only the humid hide the snake is in on the left, but access the water bowl. So the Mexican black king snake is in the hide on the left. I'll play this for you. And what I'm asking it to do is shift across the enclosure so that I can access that humid hide. I'm asking her to simply shift and pause and wait for the reinforcer. Here we go, reinforce. Good girl. Now she's engaged in using that. This guy here, I'm doing the very same, but he has a problem with impulse control and he's very excited and bites the target. So in this session, I hold him for a little bit longer and ask him to delay gratification and get better at that. So hold for a bit longer here. Bam. So by using this, I can ask them to shift into areas away from resources, away from water bowls so I can reach my hand in. Rather than grab them or lure them out of the way, I can simply ask them to take part in their cooperative care. So how do we shape a behavior? In the example of the target training, you need to work in small, successive approximations. So I would pair the food with a target, the snake eats, and it remembers that the target was there. Then I present the target without the food. If the snake looks towards target, I reinforce. Then if I present the target and it looks towards target and stays looking at the target, I'll reinforce. It's building this association here, right? Then if I present and the snake moves towards target, bam, reinforce. Move towards target, please. Small approximations, right? Then slowly, closer and closer. If it touches the target, I reinforce that. Then I can slowly move the target and get it to follow it just slightly, reinforce that. Until eventually I can present the target, move the target, and the snake follows. I can keep reinforcing that. And now the snake knows to follow the target. So then I can get it to come outside the enclosure, but I can open the door, get it to come to the enclosure threshold, reinforce that. I can open the door, put something outside the enclosure, and then I can get it to come out of the enclosure and reinforce that. Until eventually you do it in new environments with new stimulus to the point where it's comfortable target training no matter what's in front of it. And it's also how you build adaptability in them with getting them to cooperate in their own care. So there are many practical uses and why we should even do this. Let's say you've got a venomous snake. Typically what people would do is use a hook and drag that snake out so they could, rightfully so, service that enclosure in a manner that's safe. But that animal is stressed and you're inciting negative emotions to that animal, fear, frustration, anger, and that want to create space between you and them, so they can be striking and hissing and posing, and you've created a dynamic that might actually be quite dangerous. So you could simply ask them to target into a receptacle such as a bin, reinforce in there, they can be munching on their food in there, pop your lid on, service your enclosure, pop the lid off, target them back into the enclosure, reinforce, great. Positive experience, both you and the venomous snake, and it was less stressful for both of you and less dangerous. And then simply like I did before, you can ask them to move away from resources such as water bowls, or you can ask them to station onto scales and participate in their own weigh-ins. There's no need to grab the snake or animal and bag it up to weigh it. You can simply ask them to weigh themselves. Or let's say that you've had a snake go under a cabinet and you would have to drag that cabinet out to access the snake, and you're worried about the runners, the feet of the object you're dragging out, crushing or hurting the snake. Well, now you can simply present the target and get them to come out of the place they're in themselves. There are many, many practical uses of getting an animal to cooperate in their own care. Here's an example from Laura Torini, which allowed me to use this clip of her training a retic to accept a microchip injection.
Now I'm going to touch him for the first time with the needle. And when he feels the needle for the very first time ever, he turns around and he comes back out the hole towards me. So that's where I know that we have to start and work on that approximation. So now this is stage 4, and TC is through the protected contact. He was not paying attention to Jim at all. He was focusing on me. And so I had gone up there to station TC exactly where I needed him to be. And in order to keep him there, I told Jim to go ahead and deliver the reinforcement. So TC has his food. I'm touching him in the lower third of his body, which he is completely used to. I'm allowing him to anchor around my hand while he eats. That's something he normally does. He finds whatever is closest and he anchors the lower third of his body around it while he eats his food. And so while he's doing that, I go ahead and do the microchip implant. I'm watching TC's body language very closely. I don't see any change in the behavior that I'm witnessing in the front part of his body, and he's coiled around my hand just like he normally does when he eats. So it didn't seem to bother him that I implanted the chip while he was eating, and it worked very well in this particular case.
So what Laurie did there was she saw that there was a reaction from her snake and it swang round back towards her. She had to work at smaller approximations and getting him comfortable with the sensation to the point near the end there where she could just inject the snake, and it was very calm for both people involved. I've done this with giraffes. We started on, you would poke their neck with your finger, and then if they lean into it, you would reinforce, and you get them to lean into it and do multiple repetitions. Okay, they're leaning into a finger. Then you go for a pen, slightly bit more pointier. Lean into it on the neck, reinforce with food. Someone else is reinforcing whilst you're up by the neck. Then you go to a toothpick, a little bit sharper, lean into it, reinforce. Then you work you up to the needle, and then eventually you can get them to allow you to inject them and deliver what you're going to inject in a way that is less stressful, and they consented to it. So you can totally see why this is a massive deal. Let's say that was a baby mainland retic and not a super dwarf. By doing this early on in the future, if she has a big mainland retic that is used to cooperating in its own care, it's far less dangerous to have a mainland that's just going to allow you to take and inject them with a microchip than restraining it by the head and multiple people grabbing its coils and forcefully doing it. When an animal will, again, contextualize that emotion and that experience and remember that. And then maybe in the future, that animal knows that you're going to do something and wants to create space between you and it, and that's going to involve teeth. So by starting this early, it's going to reduce a whole load of problems in the future. So we've gone from forcibly moving them against their will to asking them to willingly move through their own choice. So, okay, so we've described how to do it from the start, but how about I show you? So this is a session with the first session with my bearded dragon Nugget. Nugget hasn't been target trained with this target, or hasn't been target trained in years. Nor in this environment, so everything about the situation is novel. In this video, I'm using mealworms as a reinforcer because they're small and I can do many repetitions in one session. So what I'm looking for here is to get her to look at the target and reinforce it. She looked, I drop a mealworm in front of her, reinforced. We're going to do multiple repetitions here of her simply just looking at the target to build this powerful association. So she looks, reinforce. She looked, reinforce. It's as simple as that. It's the foundationals we're building to shaping more behaviors from her in the future. Again, she looked, reinforced. You can see how immediate I tried to reinforce when she looks. The closer the delay from the action that you want and the reinforcement, the better they're going to learn. Again, she swang around, looked at it, reinforce. So this one, she's a bit distracted, and then she looked, I reinforced. And she does something in a moment which is fantastic. She allows me to skip some steps because she does a behavior that I was trying to work my way up to. So again, I just want her to, during this moment, I was going to get her just to look again. But actually she does something here, and she goes straight up to it, and she holds herself at the target. And then I reinforce that because I can skip steps by capturing that behavior and reinforcing that. So I thought, fantastic, that was great. But then I go back a step and still doing a small approximation of looking, and she decides to do it again. I just want her to look, not be distracted, and she comes forward. But now she goes to bite the target, and I was going to reinforce, but she bites, and I hold, and I want to wait for the pause and reinforce the pause, not the bite, because it's not a behavior I want her to proceed with. This is me getting a little bit ambitious here. I wonder if I can get her to do it. And she does. She comes straight over. And I realised that I was asking her to move a little bit away. So I brought the food down a little bit early. A little bit of luring going on there. But it's okay. And this one is the last final one, where I hold it down. And she comes straight over. And I put it down to the floor. And I held a little bit of a delay, a little bit longer this time. And I reinforce. So you can see here where we went from brand spanking new to looking at the target to just reinforcing those tiny behaviors using these tiny approximations until eventually she allowed me to skip a step, and now I could get her to move across and target at my target. Until eventually, as we work on this, I can get her to move in and out of the enclosure, onto scales, down into the hallway, down the stairs maybe, whatever I need to do to get her to cooperate in her own care. This target training will allow me to do that. This is the part in the talk where I was allowing questions to the audience, but there you are. Thank you very much.